this is Stalnaker with Hub Culture, and we're at the World Climate Summit in Durban, South Africa, against the backdrop of COP17. I'm with Terry Booysen from the Corporate Governance Framework here in South Africa, and we're going to have a little bit of a chat about what it is you guys do. What are you doing in the context of COP?
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Stan. Stan, our company is a corporate governance framework company that conducts research on various aspects related to corporate governance, risk and compliance. And essentially it's there to assist directors of boards to understand issues attached to governance. And in most
Specifically in South Africa?
Well, yes, but also obviously with international concerns. So for example, you've got an act like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977. What would its relevance be to a South African board of directors in the context of its trading with a US partner, for example? So in many instances you would find that directors on boards would say, well, from a governance point of view, they need to observe the laws of a King 3 kind of recommendation. King 3 is an internationally benchmarked practice of governance.
So I understand there's King 1, King 2,
there's
King
a King
3.
1.
What exactly is that? Is that a South African thing or an international thing?
Well, I think, if you look at it in the context of how it evolved, in 1994 we had King 1, which was essentially mostly focused on the establishment of a board and more relative to that of South Africa, with a hint or a flavor of what was going on overseas. King 2, a lot more internationally focused, bringing it more to a first world order, if you will. And then King 3, which was released in 2009, effective in March 2010, thereabouts, was definitely a far closer alignment to international best practices of corporate governance, risk and compliance, and then also unifying it to the closer alliance, for example, with our new Companies Act of 2008. So essentially King 3 now, what we have is a list of guidelines, mostly for organizations at listed level to follow, to making sure that they're observing certain laws of governance.
So these are corporate governance guidelines. And
Absolutely.
Are climate issues and agendas included in that?
To an extent, yes. In terms of King 3, we now have what we call an integrated report, which looks at the people component, the planet component, and the profit component. So a lot more aligned to the issues of climate and people compared to what we hadn't seen in the past. So essentially, the board of directors should be guided by the principles in terms of King 3. And then, of course, the questions arise is, now that you've observed those recommendations of King 3, are you now fully compliant? And are you a good and a well-governed organization? And I think that's where it starts getting rather interesting in terms of understanding, what is the minimalistic things we should be doing versus the things we should be doing as an organization to mature ourselves in terms of some of the issues we've been hearing about at this World Climate Summit. And that, I think, is where the real trick comes in, as we've just come out of a session now where we've heard certain organizations saying, what's that extra step? How do we go beyond? And I guess for me the question is, where does it start? And that's where our discussion started earlier on.
And so, do you find that these companies that are part of this governance framework are taking climate change seriously? How much does the planet, in terms of the people, planet, and profit kind of matrix, how much is that really registering? Are you seeing real action, or is it all just talk?
Stan, I think there are certainly those who are very, very keen on making sure that there's a visible, notable difference, showing the value to the stakeholders, mostly to the shareholders, of course. And then there are admittedly those who I would suggest are kind of looking more towards a tick box type exercise, making sure that they're compliant with the minimum requirements. And no doubt, I would imagine you're experiencing something quite similar in the overseas markets as well.
Yeah, there are varying degrees of participation wherever you are. So.
Yeah, no, we find that. And I guess for me, what's important is that it's really important to understand that the supply chain understands why these things need to happen. And really that starts at home. And so I'm a very strong advocate of suggesting that leadership is not just about the leadership of a business, but indeed the leadership and the parameters set by government and the way in which government sets these parameters for business to operate. And that those rules, if you will, flow right through the supply chain, right down literally to home. How are we disciplining our children? And that's a discussion that you and I started earlier on. Is to understand, are children observing what's going on at home and taking those ethical, moralistic values to school, and from school to the universities, and from the universities to their first line of employment? And then as they grow through the supply chain of a business, are they actually leading those examples of good leadership as citizens for change? And that for me is very important.
Right, and so we talked a little bit about the idea of education with regard to this. What's happening here in South Africa around these issues? Are environmental principles being included in primary and middle level education?
Very good question, Stan, and that's I think that's very close to me. I don't believe it's happening half enough, quite honestly, to the extent that if you compare the kind of education systems that we know in South Africa to be the case compared to a first world country, well, clearly we have our issues. As we've just heard in one of the sessions, basic things like running water and lights, in many of our rural schools just is non-existent. So there's a huge gap just in South Africa between the haves and the have-nots, the rural-based schools to the urban-based schools. So there's massive differences there. So the challenges that we have from a schooling system is not necessarily only about the quality of education, but the foundations that require a better education system to improve, to become aligned more to first world standards. So issues like, for example, sustainability, planting trees in an urban environment versus a rural environment school is quite honestly, not there.
Yeah.
And I think you would understand the reasons why. We have many schools in our country that don't even have a desk. Literally, they have no desks. There is no environment for them to learn. They sit under a tree, or for those instances where they do have a school, it might not have a roof. Certainly no electricity, and that's certainly a very big challenge that we have in South Africa, and one that would need to be addressed, in my understanding and opinion, far earlier than the tree itself. Yeah. So not to say the tree is not important, because it is. It's very, very important for the
sounds
sustainability.
like the tree is the school.
But the tree is
right?
the school, and because well, in a lot of cases, and because the tree might also happen to be the very source for sustainability of cooking a meal that night, you could find that the tree itself is getting smaller as we're trimming the branches, because they don't have the necessary resources to cook their meals that night. So it's a very complex situation. And the way I see it is that the kind of assistance that these schools would be requiring would be the more foundational issues for what it takes to put a child through decent, and quality schooling.
Yeah, it's multifaceted.
Very much so.
Okay, great. Well, not exactly encouraging, but at the same time, hopefully some innovations are coming down the pipe that will help to adjust this or to solve the issue.
Yeah.
But it's great to hear more of a perspective about what's happening here in South Africa and why the reasons why it's not being included in it's all about, I guess, fighting fires and first priorities. But probably good to think about ways that we can be increasing that. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Stan.
Great.
Right, good.
So I'm Stan Stalnaker with Hub Culture at the World Climate Summit in South Africa.